Okay, so today I'm very happy to introduce our seminar speaker, Stephen Lopez from Northeastern University. So just to give you a little bit about Stephen, I think he's going to go through his past a little bit, but he hails from the Miami, Fort Lauderdale metro area. However, he was born in New Jersey, just like yours truly. I think he's going to talk about his trajectory as a Cuban American chemist in STEM, and kind of discuss some of the challenges associated with diversity and inclusion in the STEM disciplines. He has a BS from NYU from 2010. That's actually where he and I first met each other. He then went on to UCLA for his doctoral degree, which I know for many of our students is a transfer school goal. So there he studied with Ken Houck, and that's where he first became more familiarized with computational chemistry and sort of applying computer models to understand the way organic reactions work. And again, for our 12 students, focusing predominantly, I believe, on paracyclic type reactions. He then went on to Harvard University to do a postdoc with Alana Sparagusic, where he learned more about sort of more theoretical computational chemistry, got more of an introduction to machine learning. And now he is an assistant professor at Northeastern University in Boston. And I know he's not going to talk about his research too much, but you can really see in a lot of his work, those past influences of his training really tying all together into what he focuses on now, which is sort of the intersection of organic chemistry, material science, and computational chemistry. And I think it's and Stephen is very big on collaboration and working with experimentalists. So for those of you who are thinking about maybe going into the STEM disciplines, I think you might want to pay attention to that, because I think, chemistry used to be really different. And I think now there's a lot more cooperation and collaboration between experimentalists and theoretical chemists or computational chemists. So I think his work is really indicative of kind of the direction that chemistry is going in, or at least the way I see it. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Stephen, and I want to thank you for donating your time to us and speaking with us today.
Okay, thanks very much for that really nice and personal introduction. I was just adding my pronouns to the to my name here on the participants list. So yeah, it's absolutely a pleasure to be invited to the seminar and to share some of my trajectory, a little bit about my work, some of my experiences, and the things that I guess helped me decide to become a professor of computational chemistry, focusing in organic chemistry in particular. So I'll start with maybe just this, intro, or this kind of title slide. So, my lab is really interested in green chemistry, and that's a really broad topic, right? We can imagine green chemistry as maybe as broadly as just reimagining how we do chemistry, how we generate, how we make materials, how we make drugs, how we make all kinds of different things, but in a more green and sustainable way. And there's a lot that we could dive into. So I'll hope to touch on a little bit of that. And a lot of that has to do with my past experiences that has shaped that. And then moving on, through diverse coworkers, diversity, inclusion, equity is an incredibly important thing. And I'm something I've been involved with also since, I guess, a bit during undergrad, but really during graduate school. I'll tell you a little bit about a nonprofit that I started that actually Christina was a leader in as well for a while, and it's still reasonably active too. So that's something I'm always have in mind, not just my own identity as a person from an underrepresented group in science, but helping to raise up many others through my lab and my classes. So this faculty job is kind of perfect in that sense, because I have no shortage of opportunities to make impacts in that way. And then finally, collaborations and computations. So computations, I think to me early on, especially as an undergrad when I first got to know Christina, were kind of scary, you know, like math. And I never thought that they could be possible in chemistry. So the you know, chemistry in my mind was always, you know, a wet lab, we mix chemicals, right? Maybe you get a color change once in a while, maybe a little explosion, but not too big. And that was chemistry, right? So I found out, as I'll kind of describe, that that chemistry can be theoretical as well, and having the involvement of collaborators, people that can do the experiment, and with me making predictions about these reactions, you can lead oftentimes to a much more powerful product. You can actually get to the real mechanisms and the intricacies of an organic reaction by combining both expertises. So yeah, so just I guess my Twitter information is here if you want to follow us. And you know, I think one thing that I want to start out the talk with is this kind of typical introductions, right? So typically, you know, someone says, I mean, Christina had a little bit more of a personal touch there, but usually when people are introduced, you know, they say, well, you know, Stephen went to NYU, and then he went on to UCLA, and then he went to Harvard, and like everything was perfect the whole time. There was never any self-doubt about, you know, what would happen next, or what we would do, or what, you know, whether a paper would get accepted or anything like that. But I think the purpose of this talk, and which is why I think it's such a brilliant idea that this lecture series has been set up in the first place, is you get to see the scientists for who they are, as a real, you know, person, so to speak. I know a lot of times, definitely myself as an undergraduate and graduate student as well, thought about, you know, professors almost as this, you know, super smart, like untouchable kind of entity. But, you know, all of us start as students. And, you know, if we're lucky enough to be able to teach students, you know, it's very rewarding, and students, you know, feel free to like engage, you know, with us. Come to our office hours, please. And but in this talk, you know, go ahead and jump in and ask any questions. I'll be very happy to stop and explain as we go through. So yes, I went to these 3 places. I spent time there, and I'll tell you about some of the things that happened there that influenced it. But before I got to NYU, as Christina mentioned, I was born in New Jersey, in the great state, as it's been called, arguable, but we won't get into that today. I was born in Secaucus, which is not too far from New York City, which is just here, this little kind of thin strip of land. Christina's from a little further south in New Jersey, and
Central Jersey, to be clear.
Yes, of course, and we must be clear, as is customary with East Coast people. And yeah, so I started in New Jersey. I grew up there, but I think we have to go even further back to the very beginning. So to the very beginning, I'd like to introduce my grandparents, both here. So this is them fishing in Naples, Florida. My grandfather here dressed up as Pitbull to surprise my grandmother for her birthday. We're both born in Cuba, as you can see here, about 10 years apart. And they, you know, I'll give a little bit more information about why they left Cuba in a bit, but I'll also introduce my parents. So these are some really pretty 80s fabulous and maybe embarrassing pictures of them that they definitely don't know that I have on this slide. So Mercy and Manny Lopez. So my dad was born in Cuba, my mom was born here in Jersey City, New Jersey, so even closer to New York. And her parents, you know, were Cuban as well. So I guess with all this talk of Cuba, we should take a look at that island on Google Maps. So Cuba is a place that I spent my entire childhood hearing about, how, you know, great it was, and how, you know, a miserable guy named Fidel Castro came and ruined everything. And that is, you know, something that was always very much front of mind, and just a big part of my growing up was just hearing about all of this. And it's been really amazing, because while no one in my family has gone back to Cuba since they left, because my grandparents were always talking about it, was really curious about it, and got in touch with some of my family that's still there. and actually have gone to visit them now, I guess like 5 times. So it's been just a really amazing kind of just cultural experience to go back to where, you know, to where all these stories come from, and to get reconnected with my culture. So I think, you know, for a lot of countries, you know, while it might be expensive to fly back or, you know, drive back to the country you're from, with Cuba, it's actually hard because of the politics, right? So it's for a long time was illegal from the Cuban side for Americans to come. It was like difficult, if nothing else, for Cubans to come to the United States, right? It's a kind of a complicated political history, but it was a big part of it. So it turns out, so this is, if you do a zoom in of Havana here, this is where my family lives, this little like Google star right here. So it's about a 20-minute drive into the old part of the city, and it's pretty cool. So depending on what you've heard about Cuba, you might associate it with, you know, cigars or old cars, beaches, of course, right? So these are, I took this one on the left and stole the one on the right here from Google. This is a really famous beach that's there. And this is more typical though of the actual landscape when you're there. So there's a lot of buildings, especially in the city, that frankly look like a bomb have hit them, right? Like it's bad, and it's mostly because the cities were left to just kind of, you know, deteriorate after the revolution in the 50s, because supposedly the countryside had been ignored and the city had been, you know, the city was this like kind of you know, image of like the Yankees, right? This like imperialist capitalist emblem. So they were left basically to fall down, and that's what we've seen a lot of in Havana in particular when I go visit. So all these things though, for better or worse, are all correlated to plenty of political oppression. So much of the reason that my family left Cuba in the first place was to escape this kind of, you know, political persecution and oppression. So, you know, there is effectively no freedom of speech there. There are no, you know, competing newspapers. There are no leaks in the New York Times or the Havana Times, if you will. It's just, right, the state thing. And I'll tell you a few stories that had happened. So my grandfather, for example, so he spent 6 months in jail because there was a rationing of milk in Havana in, like, I guess 1963, and he had 2 kids, right? And he wasn't literally not getting enough milk to like feed his kids. So he had this deal with the corner store guy, bodeguero, that would sell him the milk, right, on the black market for more money. And the deal was that if they ever got caught, that he would tell the cops that, you know, he like was stolen. So anyway, eventually the milk like black market police came and caught him, and he got sent to jail on the other side of the island, like to the tune of 7-hour drive away for 6 months. Supposed to be 4 months, but they decided at 6 months to let him out. And then when he came back to Havana, they knocked on his door and said, "Hey, like, you stole like more milk like 2 weeks ago." He's like, "How? That's impossible. I was in jail." And they're like, "No, you stole it. So you had better think about what you're going to do if you're going to stay in the country or if you're going to get out, because, you know, you're going to go to jail again." Because they knew, because he had a job and was an accountant and connected to the government, that he was not going to cooperate, basically. So they had to leave, and they did. And this had a lot to do with, you know, Fidel Castro, who came over, who like took over the country and basically disrupted, you know, my entire family's history. So yeah, this is just like a military fort that's there in Havana. So they left Cuba for Madrid, and they went from, you know, all the way left, Fidel Castro's Cuba, to Franco's Spain. So, and they loved Spain because at least there was this idea that, you know, while you couldn't criticize the government, they were already used to that, you could actually make money, right? So they were very much, my grandfather worked in construction there, got, you know, so from being an accountant to working in construction, it was a big change. And they actually wanted to stay, but then kind of the rest of the family that was in Cuba came to the United States, and then they eventually kind of came over to to New York, but of course New York is really expensive. So then they settled in New Jersey, where there were a lot of Cubans as well. So that's how we get back to here. And oh yeah, this is me here. That's my sister and my dad, and that's kind of where I came into the picture, right? They set up this life here in the United States, and were able to start also again from scratch. Now learning English, now having an actually really cold winter, because they thought Spain was cold, and when they got to New Jersey, they found out what real cold is. So, growing up, so basically, here's me. Now, growing up first generation is not easy, right? There's a lot of conflicting thoughts, right, and kind of conflicting, things you hear at home, things you hear at school. Like my grandfather would always ask me, "Estevida, ¿qué eres?" Always that question. Steven, what are you? And the only acceptable answer was Cubano. I could not say a boy. I couldn't say tall. I couldn't say anything. It was just Cubano was the only answer. So I ended up growing up with figures, legends like Celia Cruz, of course, that's her, at home, listening to her music, almost like as if it was 1960 still, despite it being the early 90s. And there was a disconnect, right? At school, I spoke English, and at home, I spoke Spanish. And so it was, kind of strange. So there was like weird balancing, Celia with things like Nickelodeon, right? Which was like what I would watch on TV, and like try to navigate these two languages. So that was a big part of that. Luckily, baseball spanned both cultures of America and Cuba. So, naturally my parents tried to get me to play baseball, but I'm terribly uncoordinated. So you can't see here, but I'm 6'4", and I have no athletic talent, like none. So my parents tried to get me to play just about any sport they could, starting with baseball to soccer to tennis, basketball. It never worked out. So, so science, I guess, ended up being an option. Now, science was not something that I'd say my parents or grandparents ever saw as like a realistic career, right? Like to be a scientist, like what does that mean? Like you had a few options, I think, as a first generation Cuban kid. You could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, you could be an engineer, but I don't know if people really knew what that was. And maybe a rich banker would also be a good option. But science, I was kind of stubborn about science, right? Like I took classes, in middle school and then in high school, especially, where I started to, find out what part of science was really the most interesting to me. And, ultimately that stubbornness, for better or worse, led me to this kind of position. So anyway, that's kind of a little blurb I wanted to give on growing up first generation. After growing up in New Jersey, I was there till I was about in first grade, and then we moved to Florida, here to Miami, was where we started out. You can see it's really not too far from Havana, Cuba. It's like really close. And I think after in middle school, I moved up to Fort Lauderdale and ended up at this place, Cypress Bay High School. It was an enormous high school. We had 1,000, maybe 1,100 people graduate in my class. And I had a kind of curious experience there, which was that the school was 70% Spanish speaking, and then it was about 10% Haitian Creole speaking. So, I did not feel at all like an underrepresented minority while I was there. In fact, I felt I was part of the majority there, but I didn't realize how different that was, and how I would feel when I would go to a place where I was part of a minority group instead of a majority group. So anyway, so I was in high school. That's where I really started to develop my love for chemistry. So I took every chemistry class basically that I could. As soon as I was able, I got a job at Domino's Pizza. So I started there at $6.25 an hour, and was basically saving up money for college and my car and whatever else 16-year-olds save up for. But that's kind of where I got started. Then I remember I heard from a friend that this other place, the Ultimate Burrito, was hiring. So I moved over there because instead of $6.25, they were paying $7.50. So this was a big deal. So off I went to the Ultimate Burrito. This is kind of funny that it says authentically Mexican because it was owned by a Cuban guy. And now, having tasted real Mexican food, being out in California for a while, it was most certainly not authentic. I also spent a lot of time at Broward Community College while I was in high school and in the summer periods, in between the academic years. And this was, this was a very important event or time that I spent outside of high school. First, to just be in a college environment, which was very, I think, transformative in just my decision to even want to go to college. And second, in my current efforts to engage with community college students, both through my laboratory and through my nonprofit as well. So yeah, so I can't stress enough how much of a supporter I am of the community college endeavor, and how great it is that all of you that are joining as students are taking the time out of your super busy schedules to listen to my talk. So thanks again for doing that. So anyway, my time in Florida kind of came to a close. I applied to many schools and was able to transfer some of my credits over to New York University, which is where I decided to go for undergraduate. And New York University is a very expensive school, and I was very, very, very lucky to have a scholarship from the American Chemical Society, which ended up paying more than 50% of my tuition there. Now, as you can see, this snowy Washington Square Park is very different from Miami, right? This was a big shock for me to come to a place like this where the climate was so radically different. The social climate was also very different. Like, for once, I learned that I kind of had an accent for a while. Like I would say like espresso instead of espresso, and an expressway instead of expressway, all kinds of stuff. And this being in this kind of environment was really different. And I think what was also really challenging was to meet so many other smart people, right? Like in high school, I felt like I was, like close to like the top of my class, and I was like the smartest kid around, right? And then I went to NYU, and I was like, well, everybody is smart here. And that has been a process that has been almost constant as I've pushed myself and moved to the next steps of my education and career. So I guess I just wanted to make sure, I address those things before going forward. So, okay, so I got to NYU. I almost immediately declared a biochemistry major. I had this idea that I liked biology and I liked chemistry, so I would create a biochemistry major. Well, I found out I don't like proteins. Proteins are wildly too complicated for me. They're just big and squishy and disordered. So after taking an organic chemistry class, I switched to a chemistry major. And while I was involved with that, I was able to, sorry, I turned off my video for a second. Yeah, so I was able to study abroad in Florence, Italy, which was really, really great, and had a break basically from science, which we all need, I think, once in a while. And very important to my trajectory was doing undergraduate research. Now, undergraduate research is a really interesting kind of experience, and it really varies, right? And I'm going to give you two examples of how much it can vary. At least as it was for me. And it's, getting started sometimes can be hard too. I want to just generally say that, talk to your professors, send them an email if it's intimidating to talk in person. And there are a lot of different opportunities to get involved with research, if not, locally at Foothill, at other places as well. So that's just, I'd be happy to talk with any of you if you have any questions about how to get started on that. So first I did research with Richard Borowski in a biology lab. So this guy is really famous for basically discovering that many cave fish don't essentially have eyes or functioning eyes. So I spent that summer with him and realized that I am just like not into proteins, and eyes and complicated things like that. It turns out I actually am much more interested in actual molecules and like atoms and where they are and electron flow and things like that. So that's where I got involved with James Canary, or Jim Canary. His lab, I was there for about 2.5 years. That's where Christina was also doing undergraduate research. And while I was there, despite it being a much better kind of academic fit for me, in the, just checking time here, okay. Despite it being a better fit with, you know, organic chemistry, I slowly kind of figured out that while I was interested in the organic chemistry, the actual experiments part was not seamless, let's say. It was, I struggled, right? And I don't know why I struggled, but it was kind of like the baseball, basketball, tennis thing. It was this hand-eye coordination problem. And I like just made a lot of silly mistakes. I like to joke with Jim, I still do, that I was maybe his most expensive undergraduate, from like the glassware that I broke, from the machines that I nearly broke. Christina, I'm sure, remembers the circular dichroism incident of 2009. It was challenging, you know, but what I learned from that experience was not that I'm a bad researcher or bad at science or something like that, but instead that experimental organic chemistry wasn't for me. It kind of taught me what I didn't want to do with the rest of my time. So a lot of times, I should say, organic chemistry or undergraduate research helps you to figure out what you don't want to do, which can be really important as you develop and go forward. So I finished my time at NYU, and with Jim's advice, decided to go out to UCLA to do my PhD well, with Ken Hauk, as Christina mentioned. So this is a picture of Ken over here. So he is probably the founder of the field of computational organic chemistry. And he started that back in the 70s, in the late 70s. And this was the research group that I was a part of, right? So from a relatively small group of about 10-ish students at NYU, I went to this, 45-person lab. And that was a big change too, because again, I went through that same experience of, I was doing pretty well at NYU, I got into UCLA, and now everybody's smart at UCLA too. So this kind of imposter syndrome is definitely something that I went through, still kind of go through sometimes, but it's an ongoing challenge. But at the end, if you grow from that experience, it can go a long way. So this is me kind of way back here. And this is a really young kind of throwback picture of me while we were working on Computations to find new dyes for surgery tracking is something that we were doing. And then this was another subgroup that I was involved with, where we were looking for new materials for solar cells and solar energy conversion towards green chemistry. So I was there for 5 years. I left UCLA and then got a fellowship with the Department of Energy and started my postdoctoral studies at Harvard, again, back to a snowy place. I learned basically how to apply machine learning to chemistry. So being able to, code molecules as, ones and zeros, and learning and having the computer learn their properties, transferring some of my chemical knowledge to the computer so it could make similar kind of predictions that I would make as a human chemist. And after 2 years at Harvard, I came just across the Charles River to Northeastern, where I started as an assistant professor in 2017. So this is, I guess, kind of a summary, right? Like a visual summary of my journey through science, the variety of different fields that I was exposed to, and the big changes in geography and types of science that I did over the last 10 years, really. So I want to just kind of, before I get into what my lab does and what motivates us, I want to just kind of talk a little bit about what it means to be a faculty member at what's called a Research One institution. So a place where there's significant, substantial research activity. So this professor job, right? So there is, so I have a research group, right? So in my research group, I have undergraduates, I have visiting students, increasing number of community college students. We have research interns. We have graduate students, so these are people that are working towards their PhDs, as well as postdocs, which are researchers that already have a doctorate degree, but are moving on to industry position or an academic position where they'll have a leadership role in the scientific endeavor. And to be able to do this, we have funding from government funding agencies like the National Science Foundation. And then we publish our results in journals that people can read in an open, we try for an open access kind of way, and they could find out about the results that we've done. We don't keep them secret. We like to share those results. And a less significant but incredibly important part of my job is to teach typically the organic chemistry class or the physical chemistry classes for early on, I guess like a second-year course, or more of a fourth-year course for the quantum chemistry class. And those are the two main classes that I teach. And service and outreach is incredibly important as well, and an important part of the job. So I lean on my nonprofit, the Alliance for Diversity in Science and Engineering, to help us, to do that outreach and to coordinate that, as well as to inspire graduate students and undergraduates to get into the communities themselves and communicate some of the cool science that we've been doing, and to motivate people to get into science, because there is a real shortage of researchers out there, and especially from underrepresented groups. So we're very much focused on that. So this is kind of what my job looks like, I guess. This is my the building where my lab is. So we're here on the third floor. This is my group here. So we have undergrads, grad students, and postdocs, as I mentioned. And the types of work that my group does is, we're a computational chemistry group. I promise there will be no equations on this talk. It's and we're usually is a maximum of one equation anyway, because they're kind of long. So what do we do with this? Well, we use these calculations to find new materials and molecules that can act as alternatives to chemotherapy. So chemotherapy is a really taxing and difficult process for a human to undergo, right? So we're looking for new strategies, new molecules that can literally just be turned on by light and locally kill tumor cells without having to lose your hair, lose your appetite, be hospital bound for a long time. That's been a really exciting process, and we've been, been funded and working with companies locally to do that. We're really interested in understanding how photochemical reactions happen. These are really special kinds of reactions because they're just literally promoted and pushed forward by sunlight. So this is, I guess what's really important about the chemistry here is these reactions happen on an impossibly short time scale. So we're talking femtoseconds, which is like a billionth of a millionth of a second, right? So it's hard to comprehend how short this reaction is. And because it's so short, experimentalists can't see the molecules change on a femtosecond by femtosecond basis. But computations can give that kind of atomistic resolution. And our chemistry, I like to say that my superpower as a chemist is that I can look at a molecule and say, oh, this is going to be stable, this is unstable, this is an acidic part of the molecule. But we don't have that kind of intuition, right? That chemical intuition in the excited state or in light-driven reactions that we do on the ground state. So computations are going to help us move forward in this kind of rational design of new molecules and reactions. We're also developing new materials for solar cells. So the idea here is I guess in a phrase, we're tricking plastics into behaving like metals. Right now, solar cells that are on top of, houses and stuff are made of metals and generally need government subsidy to make them remotely affordable. So when we're using things like plastic bottles, trash bags, like things that you just throw away, right? And making them act like metals through chemistry, we can definitely imagine a more green future with solar panels that we can just, recycle and reuse. And this is a database that we came up with, but maybe just for time's sake, I'll skip over that. Okay, so why do I care about green chemistry? Let's start from the beginning. So this is a video that I got from the NASA Climate Division. This shows This is going to show a time lapse from 1880 until the present day of local departures from average temperatures across the globe all at once. Okay, so if you see the blue shades, this is 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, which is 2 degrees Celsius is a lot, of below average temperatures, and the red shades are the 2 degrees above average. So let's start here from the 1880s. So you can see there's kind of a lot of blue, right? Which maybe you'd be surprised about in the current kind of knowledge that people have about climate change. But starting in the 1920s, where we are now, there starts to be more significant and pronounced shades of orange and red on the global map. And well, there seems to be a cool down in the 60s here, but pretty much after 1975, it's totally different. I mean, now most of the time you're above average. Most of the time there are kind of these scary shades of red. And by the time you get to 2015, you've got a very kind of scary map here. And I think what's particularly scary about this map is that the reds are concentrated in the poles, right? And that's where we have the largest reservations of ice, of liquid fresh water. And when those temperatures are elevated there, this ice melts and it raises sea levels, which is a real problem, right? As we know, being, you know, coastal here in Boston and coastal there in the Bay Area, and that's going to continue to have important changes. Now, maybe 120 years isn't enough data for you, right? Maybe you're more skeptical that maybe this is just a localized bit of data. So what I have here is another plot from NASA that shows the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 450,000 years. Okay, this shows, we know that this is the level of carbon dioxide in parts per million, and you could it almost kind of looks cyclical here, right? For much of this 450,000 years, but there hits a point, right, some time ago, like less than 20,000 years ago, where this change and this increase it seems almost to be irreversible, right? It's almost a vertical increase. And this is going to continue to go up. This is going to continue to go up, which is going to continue to increase the temperatures on the planet, because carbon dioxide acts like a blanket to keep heat in on Earth. So we have to do something about it. And given this platform, you know, as being a researcher with students that are really motivated to make an impact in our global situation, we're doing everything we can to offset this kind of increase in carbon dioxide and climate change. You know, and this is going to affect places that are coastal. Most of the world's major cities are on the water, so there's, you know, expensive real estate, infrastructure, and the like that are here in Boston, for example, that are going to continue to be affected, and these are going to be very expensive storms. But maybe even scarier, honestly, than Boston is our low-lying islands. So this is Pigeon Key in the Florida Keys. This island in particular has the benefit of literally being attached to the United States. So it has the possibility of getting relief and aid when storms happen, right? As the ocean continues to rise. But we should be very cognizant that many of the islands, most of the islands in the world, are in fact not attached to the United States with a bridge, and are going to be the first places to suffer literal loss of human life, property, and livelihoods, right? That are just going to be changed and wiped out because, you know, they're just not attached to that money. So it's really important. Like the changes that we're making now are affecting people all over the world, and it's not just we'll file an insurance claim and get some money. It's people die. So that's what motivates me, right, to do all of this kind of work. So this is I guess a quick article that was written about the work that we're doing, about a molecular discovery. The things I really want to show in this is, one, my awesome students here, but two, just the number of possible molecules there are, right? So the number is estimated to be around 10 to the 18th, right? So if you think of all the possible grains of sand on the planet, right, and you multiply that number by a billion, 10 to the 9th, that's the number of molecules that possibly exist on the planet. So we will never be able to calculate all of those molecules. We will never be able to make all of those molecules. Computations provide us a way to screen that kind of chemical space. Okay, so if you're wondering what does a computation actually look like, there's kind of a whole family of possible calculations here. So there are quantum mechanical methods, classical methods, and there's now the newest leaf on this tree, which is machine learning. Now, machine learning is a way where computers learn the properties of molecules very much in the way that YouTube figures out whether you like adorable puppy videos like this, which I have to click on because it's so cute. I love it. Or maybe you're into really cute cat videos, right? Let's look at this kitten. I'm not a cat person, but this is like the cutest thing I've ever seen in my life. So YouTube looks at these two, looks at how you click on these types of videos, right? And then suggests new kinds of videos, right? Maybe you get a goat video. Goat videos are really cute these days too. And we're trying to use those same kinds of algorithms to make predictions about how a molecule is going to behave. Is it going to be more like a cat molecule or more like a dog molecule? And that's really helping to accelerate a lot of the research that's going on out there. So with solar panels, we're going to skip this. I guess actually I'll skip this slide too. So we can also see molecules react in real time. So this is what's called a dynamics trajectory that was which was computed by some of my colleagues while I was in the Hauk lab. You can literally see this proton transfer happen. So for the Chem 12 students out there, this is the proton right here. You see it? It's like wiggling around. And then this oxygen, this oxyrain comes over and abstracts it. And now it's attached to that other molecule. So we can look at that like that kind of femtosecond by femtosecond trajectory and watch how these molecules approach each other to make real discoveries. Okay, so those are the kinds of science projects I'm interested in. I want to tell you about the Alliance for Diversity in Science and Engineering. This is a national nonprofit organization that I launched in 2015. We have graduate student-led chapters across the United States that all have a common mission, and that's to advance and broaden the participation of people from underrepresented groups in STEM very broadly. So these are the chapters here on the map. We've had national, what we call young researcher conferences. And these are opportunities for people to come, present their research, learn about people's research, and we have had an increasing role of community college students in this organization. So that's been really, very exciting to have everybody on board and to contribute to this in a national way. This was I don't know if you can hear this. Can you hear that? You can't. Okay, well, anyway, she's giving a testimonial of what the Young Researchers Conference was like for her. And I think my last slide here is just something I wanted to point out. I'm creating a summer research experience specifically for community college students. The idea is to build this national network of community college researchers for a next generation workforce. So this is something I'm launching this summer locally in Boston, but we'll be increasing it as I continue to get funding from national funding agencies. The idea is to teach through a series of modules the different types of computations that you can do depending on your own kind of research interests. And I think what you can gain out of it is, of course, valuable experience, get a sense for what research is really like. You don't have to come to Boston to do it because it's computational, so you can do it from California if you like. We offer a stipend, a computer, and an opportunity to expand your network to make that transition into your bachelor's degree and beyond as easy as possible. So I think I'm close to time. I would love to take questions. I'd like to just thank Christina and the rest of the team for the invitation and the opportunity to be here and to speak with many of you today. So thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that was great. It looks like Ram has his hand shot up right away. So you go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say, first of all, thank you for sharing your story and also giving us a glimpse of your excellent research that you're set up at the university there. So I had two questions I was hoping you could share with our students. One
Sure.
is you mentioned that you were the recipient of an ACS scholarship that helped
Oh,
you
yeah.
go to NYU. I'm not sure many of our students will know what an ACS scholarship is and how one can get an ACS scholarship. So if you could share that idea a little bit. And second, you also talked about the importance of undergraduate research experience. And so
Yeah.
if you could give some ideas to our students for how can one get those undergraduate research opportunities, especially considering we don't necessarily have research programs going on at the community college level.
Totally. So I'll start first with the American Chemical Society Scholars Program. So first of all, so I can send some information on it. But yeah, this is a program that's I guess administered through the Committee on Minority Affairs at the American Chemical Society, which I'm actually like an associate of. So I guess you know somebody now on the, that's occasionally on the selection committee. This is a really important program, not just because of the funds that you get, but because if you're awarded this, you're also given a mentor that's there with you the whole time that you're in the bachelor's program. And they follow up with you long after that as well. In fact, the reason I became an associate of the Committee on Minority Affairs is because the manager of that program reached out to me at the end of graduate school and asked me if I would join. And I was, totally blown away to, be part of this committee that initially kind of chose me to, to study at the college level. So, there definitely are a lot of these opportunities, and yeah, so I definitely encourage you, to apply, and I'll send some other information if you like. About undergrad research, I mean, I'll tell you what I tell the students that are in my class. It's, if any of this sounds remotely interesting, or in another class, if something sounds remotely interesting, come to your professor's office hour and tell them, I thought this reaction, this separation technique, this whatever was really cool. I wonder if I could do research about that. That was usually enough to get any professor really excited about welcoming you into their lab, or even, and if not into their lab, to help you make the connection to another faculty member, right? I mentioned to Christina, we all started out as students, right? So we kind of still, see each other in that same way, like at that same kind of that level. So if you're interested, I think, you can do a lot, I think, with undergraduate research. And as I described, even if it's not, the first one is not a perfect fit, right? You can try it out, decide, oh, this is actually not the kind of thing I like. I'm actually more interested in the other, and you can kind of refine your own trajectory going forward. I think, Jeff?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
So kind of building on that point about, encouraging students to go talk to their professors, if they're interested, what maybe skills, could you suggest maybe like a checklist? What are things to learn to do, right? I mean, you've got your chemistry major, sure. Right. I mean, that's giving you a lot of your basics, but what are other things that students should sort of pay special attention to develop along the way as well?
Yeah, great question. So I think what I'll say is that I think my most successful undergrad researchers that are in my lab and that I've observed over the years is a willingness to just try again, right? It's a kind of beneficial stubbornness that makes you want to try that reaction one more time, to try it a different way, to collaborate with others and figure out, maybe why the experiment isn't working the way you expected it. Because sometimes, a bad result is a good result because you learn something from it. Like, the idea is to learn something from every experiment. So I think, in addition, of course, to the knowledge that you gain from your classes, I think a curiosity, right, really goes a long way, and an open mind too.
So, Stephen, there were a couple questions in the chat as well, if you wouldn't mind answering. There was one about how you, there's just a couple, one about how do you prioritize research projects, which I think also kind of might add a little bit to Jeff's question as far as, Yeah, how like maybe some other soft skills, right, that aren't necessarily just related to actual research in chemistry. So go ahead.
Hang on, I'm in the part about, I got distracted about the rum and the Fenway Park.
Oh, you're pretty far back.
Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the questions was about how you prioritize your projects, and then another one was
Yeah.
about when you were talking about developing new dyes for, I guess, imaging and stuff. So kind of what was the highlight of that project?
I see. Okay. All right. I'm seeing now the dye one. So when we're using. Yeah. So I think. So yeah. Thanks for the question, Allegra. With the new dyes for surgery, this is a very much an ongoing project. We have been able to make some discoveries. This was both, I think, what was maybe the most memorable moment of that project, right? This one had led to 2 publications. One of them was kind of done in a traditional sense where, we had this idea, we computed something like 20 molecules, we did calculations on like 20 molecules, we found one that worked really well, we told our collaborators, they made it, it worked, awesome. That was almost boring because it worked too well, right? We had another project that was really cool, was it was a follow-up to this one. It was like, rather than starting with a handful of molecules that like a human came up with, we used an artificial intelligence algorithm that scanned through the database that I have a chance to talk about to see molecules that had similar properties. And then we had another algorithm that basically used that kind of like good or bad, just like very kind of qualitative information, and then found a whole new class of molecules that we were then able to suggest to the collaborator as like a totally like computer guided dye discovery platform or paradigm, I guess. So I was totally blown away. I mean, and the best part about this also was that I had almost nothing to do with it. My students came up with this idea, right? They just came with this, hey, look at all these cool dyes. And I was like, where did those dyes come from? Like literally the machine picked it. And and then we immediately kind of wrote it up, and it's been a really kind of exciting direction. So that has launched a whole bunch of different research projects just from that approach actually working. So yeah, I guess so that was it. So then in terms of how to prioritize projects, I don't know if I see exactly yeah, exactly. It is like a GPS for molecules. It's just like an ocean, right? I mean, it's just an impossible number of possible molecules that the algorithm kind of quickly can sort out, right? Like these are never going to work. I'm just going to focus on this category. So with prioritizing projects, like as like the investigator, you mean, or as a student? Maybe both.
Yeah, just answer both.
Okay, so I guess as a faculty, I think for me, I'm excited about what the students are interested in, right? Like it's so much easier to get research results and get in the lab and try things all kinds of different ways when you're really passionate about it. So if a student says to me, I'm not really that into like the solar cell thing, right? Like this like plastic to metal thing, not that interested. I'm more interested in the surgery thing because maybe I had a family member that recently went through surgery and I want to apply it that way. I say go for it. Like that project's there, you should do that. So I'm very much guided by what the students want to do, as long as it generally falls into our kind of research themes, if that makes sense. Oh, and then as a student, it was same kind of thing. It was like whatever I was passionate about is what I did. And if my advisor asked me about another project I was less interested in, I always had like a result ready, but not too much. Just like, oh yeah, I got this one result. That was it.
Yeah, definitely the way to play that.
Yep.
Yeah. Kathy has a question in the chat. So Kathy's one of our organic instructors, and she's asking about how you class. So just a fair question, who makes the molecules, right?
Yeah.
I think this is not a criticism, but this is a question that computational chemists often get.
Totally. Yeah. So I think, I'll first start with, my early training, I guess, as an experimental chemist, made a big impact in in my trajectory from being kind of a typical, if you will, computational chemist, where I just, compute maybe molecules that look cool, but nobody knows how to make yet, right? So the idea of synthetic accessibility is very front and center when I think about a research project. I don't want to go down some, exploratory theory project if there's not a reasonable way to make it. So where do I get my collaborators? Well, sometimes it's the easier answer is if we're on a collaborative grant together, then basically usually there's a theory person, an experimental person, and it's kind of prescribed who you're going to work with. But otherwise, it's a lot has to do with my scientific network. So some people, we have overlap through the Alliance for Diversity in Science and Engineering, and our scientific interests match. So that's kind of my go-to collaborator. Sometimes it's local because they're here, at Northeastern. It kind of just depends, but because we're interested in such a variety of different, light promoted reactions and processes, there's a kind of a specialized experimentalist that is always, working alongside us. It's very rare that we have a purely theoretical paper. And this also works really nicely for the students, because the students get this opportunity, I think by the time they graduate, undergraduates and graduate students, to speak both languages, if you will. They speak the language of theory because they have to communicate ultimately their computed results, but also they have to understand what the experimentalists want. Like what, do they want the reaction to go faster? Do they want it to go slower? Do they want it to be selective? All those kinds of descriptors, right, of a reaction are very important for the student to be able to understand and translate into their own work. So in the end, while they might not be doing the experiments, they're like very much up to date on what experiments are being done.
Yep. And then also
Is that
too,
your
you didn't mention too how one of the collaborations is actually Noah Burns, who's at Stanford. So very close to our campus, actually.
Yeah, that's right. So Noah Burns at Stanford, he's somebody I work with through a grant that's with the Office of Naval Research, and they're interested in energy dense materials, which are more colloquially known as explosive materials. So we're all the time collaborating on making very explosive materials. So it's kind of a very cool chemistry to be working on with Noah.
Right. Yeah. I thought I'd point that out because some of the chemistry that you showed, I think, is from
like this slide right here. Yeah, and as a result, I should say that I'm in the Bay Area now that we're kind of, past this like COVID lockdown. I'm in the Bay Area about once a year. So it would be, awesome to, come and meet any of you, when I'm out there. So I'm sure maybe Christina can help make that happen.
Yep, I can do that. And then we have a question from Melissa, and I just want to point, we're 2 minutes past the hour. Steven said that he's okay for a few more minutes, but I just want to alert you all of the time in case anybody else had a class or a meeting. But Melissa, why don't you go ahead?
Got it. Hey, Steven, thank you for speaking with us today. I thought it was really funny that you grew up listening to Celia Cruz, because I grew up listening to and everyone would ask about like English rock bands. Like, I don't know those people. I know Spanish rock bands. But that being said, I was wondering if you could maybe, I know you didn't really touch on it, but like one of the things I'm really interested about in chemistry is particularly green chemistry, but also hopefully maybe coming up with a material that is decomposable. Like if you think about it, everything in our life is comprised of plastic, like a water bottle, your shampoo, your deodorant, your toothbrush. Have you worked on that? Or, I mean, I don't know, but you could share any insight on that.
Totally, yeah. Thanks, Melissa. So at the moment, so I'm writing a proposal right now with, I suppose he's an environmental engineer, I think is how I would characterize him. And he's really interested in the plastics that are basically floating around in the ocean, and basically designing plastics that are more, what's the word? I guess more easily decomposed with sunlight, right? So since, if you imagine these water bottles and the like that are just kind of floating around the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic, if we at least had, if they're going to end up in the ocean, right, which is a terrible thing, it would be great if we could design plastics that more easily would break down in the presence of sunlight and salt water. So we're writing a proposal right now on some ideas that we have for for doing just that. It's organic chemistry, right? It's at its finest, and it's related to polymer chemistry as well. So we're coming together, him as an experimentalist and an engineer, and me as a computational chemist, and now, you know, more in the artificial intelligence space to come up with a clever solution to that problem. So, but this is not going to get solved in the 3 years that the grant, you know, is going to last. It's just the beginning of a long collaboration, hopefully. So yeah, we're really interested in that kind of stuff.
Got it. That's awesome. Yeah, because I was reading an article. I know Stanford Earth, they were doing some research regarding certain enzymes that could break down certain plastics. So I was wondering if, you know, you had thought about something similar. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah. And enzymes scare me. They're too big. but definitely there's space for that. So we should encourage it.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that problem is going to be one that's going to have,
Yeah.
you know, myriad solutions at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But are there any other questions for Stephen about his life, his career, his research? I have a kind of like a shop question, so
Yeah.
whoever wants to
Sure.
stick around for that. But I want to see if anybody else has any further questions before I do that. Okay, so Stephen, the 2 + 2, what's going on with the can you go to that slide?
2 +
What's
2.
going on with the it's like a dibromide ketone.
Oh, here.
Do you guys know the order of events here? Oh, never mind. I see it. I was actually gonna ask about the elimination, but now I see that it happens in the second step. But why do you need that? Is that a building block for a subsequent step? Like, why do you need the vinyl bromide?
Yeah, so this particular reaction is not one that we've done directly. I think this was kind of just like a representative example, but it is just because it's related to those lateranes. So I'm not sure what Noah has in mind for that, but I suspect there's some kind of cross-coupling reaction that would happen after or something.
Right,
Not
and then presumably
exactly
you might need it to set the stereochemistry to start with the dibromide, right? I'm guessing.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. So I don't remember exactly what this one was, but I guess they got a good yield.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just curious. And yeah, for the 12 students, definitely something to think about how they're getting. There's a lot of stereo centers in that molecule. So to get 88% EE is really impressive.
Yeah. Yeah, so with these, I mean, with the lateranes in general, they tend to be photochemical 4-pi disrotatory electrocyclic ring closings, right? And that is able to set the to set that stereochemistry. We actually found the first example of a phototorcoselective reaction. So if you remember torcoselectivity, right, from thermal electrocyclic reactions, we found a photochemical version of these. And photochemistry, like finding stereoselective photochemical reactions is way more rare than in thermal reactions because you're basically just flying downhill, right, down these potential energy surfaces. So it doesn't have enough time really to favor one thing or another, or one effect or another. So we determined the origin of that. I guess it was in 19. It was right before the shutdown. The paper got accepted, I remember. Right. Or 20, right? So right before the paper in 20. So that was cool too. So
all right. Yeah, I was just curious about it. I haven't looked at reactions like these in some time. And then Kathy's pointing out that maybe it's something to do, maybe to lower the energy of the LUMO. That's possible. Yeah. Yeah,
and those, I mean, the orbitals from the first slide, right? I mean, the energies of the orbitals, the shapes of the orbitals are just so critically important to understanding how these reactions work. Because I mean, with those super short time scales, you're talking about, an electronic transition to an excited state, and then a molecule that now is in this excited state, desperate to get back to the ground state, right? So all those orbital effects are very, very important. Yeah,
definitely. All right. Let me see. I personally don't have any further questions. I don't know if anybody else does. Matthew's asking about if you wanted to get involved in research projects, if you go to the Okay, Stephen, you took care of
Yeah, I
that.
just
All
responded.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any further questions? If not, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. I hope that you enjoyed the talk. I certainly did. And Stephen, I wanted to thank you one more time. This has been really great. I think your unique perspective is really great for our students. And it's nice for all of us to see maybe some type of chemistry that we're not necessarily looking at every day when we're teaching our classes. So thank you for that.
Of course, totally my pleasure. This was really great. Thanks for the great questions too.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.